The next topic for discussion is deduction, validity, and soundness. Each of these previous topics that we've considered so far builds toward a better understanding and explication of these ideas. As I said in the last segment, deduction, validity, and soundness are absolutely central concepts in terms of understanding logic. Now, we contrast deduction with something called induction. Okay. Induction is the study of arguments that deal with probability or likelihood. How likely is it that a conclusion follows? So many inductive inferences deal with statistics, statistical information, surveys, generalizations, and so on. The focus of our course is not on induction, but on deduction, which deals with certainty. And that concept of certainty is actually captured in this notion of validity. Okay? So, in brief, deduction deals with something we call logical certainty. Does the conclusion follow necessarily from the evidence or the premises that are offered in its support? Okay. Induction deals with questions of probability. How likely is it that a conclusion follows based on the evidence that we have? All right. With that said, let's turn to this topic of validity. We used these two examples earlier to illustrate argument structure and substitution instances. I'd like to stick with these examples for the sake of simplicity so we can clarify this notion of validity. As I said, these two arguments have something in common, and what's in common here is the argument's underlying structure. Okay? That structure looks like this. All F are G, all G are H, and all F are H. Now, even though we would accept that argument about whales and mammals and reject that argument about squares and triangles, they have something else in common besides the structure, or something about the structure that's very important, and that is this property. If these claims are true, then the conclusion, and here comes a big emphasis, must, the conclusion must be true also. I'll try not to knock down the board in my excitement here. Okay. When we interpret F, G, and H, that is when we give them a substitution instance and we talk about whales and mammals and warm-blooded things, we ask this question. Well, if the premises are true, is it necessary that the conclusion follows? If all whales are mammals and all mammals are warm-blooded, can we imagine a world in which it's false that all whales are warm-blooded? Clearly not. We know that that conclusion has to be the case. Okay? That is the essence of what we call validity. All right? An argument, a deductive argument is valid if and only if, when the premises are true, the conclusion must be true also. Okay? Validity only applies to deduction. Remember that induction is a matter of probability or likelihood. All right? Validity is about the structure of deductive arguments. All right? So this is a deductive notion. That's important to keep in mind. So when an argument is valid, and we're always referring to the structure when we talk about validity, all right? It's an issue of whether or not under interpretation these premises guarantee the truth of this conclusion. When an argument is valid, it's valid, period. It's valid for all times. Just like 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't change whether we're counting apples or we're counting oranges or we're counting people. Okay? An argument is valid once and for all. So those previous arguments we were considering, all whales are mammals, all mammals are warm-blooded, therefore all whales are warm-blooded. This argument is valid just as the other argument we looked at below, all squares are triangles, all triangles are rectangles, so all squares are rectangles. This is valid too. Okay? Now, the usual question that comes up here is this. Well, if an argument is valid, why do I have this judgment that this argument is a good one and that's a poor one? And the answer to that question is we're not just concerned with validity when we look at deductive arguments. We're also concerned with something called soundness. Right? Validity has to do with argument structure. in the abstract. If you remember back to the first segment we did on arguments, non-arguments, and logic, I suggested with a diagram that logic is about studying argument structure in the abstract. Well, validity deals with these kinds of abstract structures. All right? Soundness is something that takes into consideration the particular interpretation or substitution instance that we're dealing with. Okay? In the real world, it is false that all squares are triangles, right? So even though we're dealing with something of the form all f are g, under that particular substitution instance, we have created a false statement. And that's the reason we rejected that second argument and accepted the first argument, because those premises happen to be true. All right, so to bring this together a little bit, what we know is that soundness can be understood in the following way. An argument, and again we're talking only about deductive arguments here. An argument is sound if and only if it is valid, which means it has this structure, this integrity in the structure. And I'll use the plus sign for and here, and the premises are true in fact, in the real world. Okay? Now, this is a frequent source of confusion for people, because when we look at this issue of validity, we've raised the question, if the premises are true, does the conclusion necessarily follow? Okay. But notice we're focused on this hypothetical. If the premises are true, in any possible world that I can imagine, if the premises are true, would the conclusion have to be true also? We are not concerned with whether or not the premises are true in fact when we're asking this question about validity. You see the difference? If the moon were made of green cheese, then I could eat it. I'm not saying that the moon is made of green cheese, right? I'm creating this kind of hypothetical scenario. Well, the same is true when we deal with validity. We ask in the abstract, well, if these were true, if all squares are triangles, and if all triangles are rectangles, would it follow that all squares are rectangles? And the answer is yes. All right? So for validity, we're dealing with this hypothetical case of the premises being true. When we're dealing with soundness, we're going on to ask the question, well, are the premises true in the real world? All right? So if we can go back to our original two arguments, what we would say is this. Both of these arguments have the same underlying logical structure. And both of these arguments, because they have this structure, are valid, because we know the structure is a valid argument structure. If the premises are true, then the conclusion would have to be true also. But we distinguish this as a good argument from this as a poor argument, because this one is sound. Right? Let me write that here. This argument is sound, which means it's valid, and when we plug in the terms whales and mammals and warm-blooded things for F, G, and H, we get true statements in the real world, because lo and behold, whales are mammals and mammals are warm-blooded things. Right? So the difference between that argument and this one is that this is what we call unsound. All right? It has an argument structure that is valid, but under this substitution instance, this interpretation, these claims come out false in the real world. Okay? And that's why we have this intuition that, well, this is a good argument and this is a poor argument, even though they have the same structure. Okay? So just to recap, given this notion of argument structure, we need to be clear that validity deals with this hypothetical relationship between premises and conclusion. In other words, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true also. If it meets that requirement, it's valid. If it doesn't, then it's invalid. It's not an invalid argument, it's an invalid argument. Okay? If in addition to having a valid argument structure, when we interpret that structure, we have a substitution instance, and the premises come out true in fact in the real world, then we have what's called a sound argument. And we contrast that with an unsound argument. In terms of accepting a deductive argument as a good one, we only would accept those arguments that have soundness as a property, okay? Valid and true premises in fact.